So first of all, I'd like to thank the department for inviting me to come and speak in this series. Probably more importantly, I'd like to thank the department for all of the things that I learned while I was here. Not just the technical things, but some of the most important lessons were lessons about interacting with people and the way of working together with people, those sorts of things. And those lessons have been very important for me throughout my whole career. I also want to mention that some of the material that I'm going to be speaking about is drawn from and adapted from an unpublished manuscript called Making Software Development Organizations Work, and I'm certainly open to suggestions for better titles, that I've been working on with Catherine Britton, who is also a graduate of this department roughly the same time I was there. Catherine also worked for IBM for many years, and this is a manuscript of a book we're working on very slowly with my perspective as an executive and her perspective as a senior technical person trying to look at how software organizations work from both perspectives. So Steve kind of talked about my experience here. I won't go into too much more detail than that, other than to say that when I made a transition from the IBM Research Division to the IBM Software Group, I made a transition from an organization that's mainly focused on coming up with new technology to an organization that's mainly focused on making money by selling products. And that changed the nature of the kind of work that I did to really be focused on how to lead teams, sometimes quite large teams, in producing software products and making a business out of it. And I found that to be a lot of challenge and great fun. But I will tell you that when I left IBM at the end of 2008 and I spent a year with Morformix and then continued on the Morformix board, that was great fun as well, a different kind of fun. And I am involved with 3 companies that are listed there as an advisor in various roles, and otherwise I'm kind of retired, which is also great fun. So, you know, the title of the talk has the word software product organizations in it. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what I mean by a software product organization. So I'll tell you, I don't mean 10 guys in a garage. I mean something that is large enough that the dynamics of how people work together and how teams are structured has a lot to do with what they can get done and how they do it. All right? So that could be, you know, dozens of people. It could be tens of thousands of people. So my experience spans from, you know, small teams like at Morformix to at IBM, a couple thousand people distributed around the world. And a very interesting point is that when I compare my experiences at the 3 large companies that I worked for, some of the same issues come up over and over again. So I initially, as I was thinking about things, I was worried that I was talking about IBM, but I've since learned that big companies have the same sorts of issues. I also will tell you that I believe that a lot of the issues that I'm talking about apply to other industries. They're not unique to software, but I'm going to focus on software examples. So let me start with what I think is the conventional wisdom. Big companies can't innovate. You know, we're all familiar with all the innovation that comes from startups, et cetera. Like a lot of conventional wisdom, there's a lot of truth in that conventional wisdom. But I think, once again, we need to tease apart the meaning of the words. So what does innovate actually mean? First of all, when I talk about innovation here, I don't mean just inventing something new. I also mean getting it in the hands of the people who want to use that something. Okay? That's a really important thing, and it's a very large part of the job of having a successful business, is to go from that idea and prototype to something that you can actually get people to want to buy and to use. Also, when you think about innovation, if you think intuitively, there are different kinds of innovation. So one kind of innovation is you have a product, say like Microsoft Office. And you know, Microsoft keeps putting out new versions of Microsoft Office. There was Office, you know, in the early days, I don't know what they called it. Then there was Office 95 and Office XP and Office 2000 and whatever, 2003, 2006. There was some kind of innovation happening there. But basically, they were selling that product into a market that consisted of the same kind of people that they sold the previous ones to. That's one kind of innovation. And if you think about something like the iPhone, that kind of intuitively seems like a very different kind of innovation. They created a new market. They created a new business model with the whole app store and the subscription to content. So that feels very different than the innovation that you have in Office. Now, I said that I believe that a lot of what I'm saying applies beyond software. There is a professor at Harvard Business School named Clayton Christensen who has written 2 books and a zillion papers about innovation. The book on the left was published in '97, and he talked about 2 kinds of innovation. One is called sustaining innovation, which is like the Microsoft Office example that I gave to you. And the key point here is sustaining innovation is improving the performance or the capabilities of a product along the dimensions that are important to the existing market, the existing consumers. The evolution of Windows, or the evolution of OS X, or the evolution of Office, those are all sustaining innovations. And then he also talked about disruptive innovation, and disruptive innovations create a new market. And so the iPhone is an example of a disruptive innovation, and it introduces maybe a new technology, or it introduces a new service, and this is very important. It could introduce a new business model. It's not just about the technology. And the iPhone actually is a good example of all 3 of those sorts of things. It introduced all of those kinds of changes. So that's a disruptive innovation. I'm going to come back to Christensen's model, but first let me restate the conventional wisdom. So using the terms we just talked about, big companies are great at sustaining innovation, but can't do disruptive innovation. Now, I'm going to disagree with the can't do, but I think the conventional wisdom really is what I have written up here. And in fact, great companies become extremely competent at sustaining innovation. You look at any company that has been in business for a long time, and they will have, I mean, take IBM. They started with the work that Dr. Brooks did in the mainframe, and they're still doing it all these years later, and they're great at it, and they're making a lot of money at it. But that's very different than the disruptive kind of innovation. And
But the mainframe business was a disruptive innovation.
Absolutely, and it's very common for something to be a disruptive innovation in the beginning, and then as it succeeds as a business, to become, to have sustaining innovation applied to it over many years. And that's the way large companies bring in a lot of profit, is in that sustaining model. The problem is, you can be Kodak. You can be great at sustaining innovation in the analog photography world and completely miss the boat on the digital photography world. And the interesting thing to me is, it's not because the guys at Kodak were stupid and they didn't see what was happening. It's because they couldn't figure out how to make their organization respond effectively to this disruption. So I'm going to talk some about that. So here's an example. Okay, so this is a picture, some of us are old enough to remember when this happened. This is a picture of the Xerox Alto that was put out in 1973. It was a groundbreaking, revolutionary technology. Xerox never, ever turned it into a product. Steve Jobs turned it into a product, but Xerox didn't turn it into a product. They never delivered it into the hands of people who could use it. So I don't consider that a successful innovation on the part of Xerox. Okay, it had great impact on the industry. And I found this is really interesting. There's a book that was published earlier in 2014 by Walter Isaacson about the evolution of high tech. And he has in here a quote from, fortunately, an anonymous director at Xerox, who said that the computer will never be as important to society as the copier. And you know, with our hindsight, it's really easy to kind of laugh, just like you all did, at this guy's stupidity, right? And clearly this guy's stupid. But I don't think that's a useful way of thinking about it, because companies don't tend to put stupid people in senior leadership positions. So I think that it's more likely that there was something else that was going on here that caused him to have this kind of reaction. It's more complicated, and we need to dig into that. So the theory that companies don't do disruptive innovation because they have stupid leaders, I don't accept that. But it's a common thing that you might read. Another thing you might read is, you know, if you're going to do disruptive innovation, you got to have guts and you got to take some big bets. And if you don't, you're not going to do disruptive things. And I agree with that. That's absolutely true. But I also will say that there are plenty of leaders, and I picked on Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer here, but there are lots of these. There are plenty of leaders who made big bets that failed. I guess I have IBM. I mean, IBM invested billions of dollars in X-ray lithography because photolithography was going to reach the resolution limits, and they didn't think about phase shift masking that allowed them to keep going. Bill Gates invested I don't know how much money on a new operating system. Steve Ballmer was way ahead of the time with Pocket PC and Windows Mobile. Microsoft Bing, all of these things, huge guts to invest all the money, but they really failed. So my point here is saying that leaders are cowardly and they won't take big bets is not an adequate explanation. There's more going on here. It's more subtle. So what I'd like to do, I actually do believe that big companies can do disruptive innovation. So I want to give you two examples of big mature companies, IBM and Microsoft, successfully doing disruptive innovation in software. The first one, Eclipse, I was deeply involved in creating and leading that effort, so I can speak to that in a lot of detail. And the second one, Microsoft's Office 365, I was kind of on the sidelines, and I was able to see very closely how that was done and what happened. So I'm going to talk about these two examples, and then I'm going to come back to Christensen's model and show you how Christensen's model explains a lot of what happened here, even though if you read his first book, Christensen's book is about disruption in the disk drive industry from the beginning through to the late 90s. I think his model has a lot to say to teach us about how innovation happens. So first of all, let me just say, what is Eclipse? I just copied this from the eclipse.org website a few days ago. It's an open source project. I suspect many of you use the Java IDE and some of the other tools in Eclipse. It's also an ecosystem. It's a very important part of what Eclipse is. And the work on the core technology for Eclipse started in 1998 at IBM, and I was the executive who got that work going in IBM. And we made it into an open source project in 2001. And that was a radical move for a big company at that time. And the net is that Eclipse has completely disrupted the ecosystem around application development tools in that time. So in fact, by 2004, Eclipse had become popular enough that there was an annual conference called Eclipse Con. And in 2005 Eclipse Con, I was asked to give a keynote about how Eclipse came about. So I've selected a few slides from that talk to try to give you a contemporaneous view of what I thought we did and how we did it. And slides that have this kind of purple background to it are extracted directly from that talk. The entire talk is available at eclipsecon.org in the older slides for the older conferences. So let me start by talking about the development tool landscape in the mid to late 90s. So remember now, I worked for IBM. I want to say that because it's important to understand the business. So at that time, Visual Studio from Microsoft was becoming more and more accepted, and Microsoft was becoming very successful at using their tools to bring developers to their platform. And if you're in the business of selling a platform, one of the most important things that you have to think about is how do you get people to write applications for that platform? Because it's the applications that make people buy the platform. So Microsoft was using tools for that. At the same time, Java was starting to become important, and there were a whole bunch of different companies, all of whom made Java IDEs. You see some of them listed here. And there were Java application servers from many different companies. One of those was WebSphere from IBM. So the business IBM was interested in is, how do I make WebSphere a successful application platform? And taking one step from that, how do I bring developers to that platform? So that's really what the landscape was like. And Microsoft's competition, including IBM, was extremely fragmented. There were all these players. We were all competing with each other, building the same kind of stuff, and we were moving too slowly compared to how fast Microsoft was moving. So it was a fundamental threat to this business that IBM was trying to build at the time. So I think I've said most of this, except for the fact that in addition to bringing developers, we needed to create an ecosystem of other companies that would thrive off of our platform. And even within IBM, we were fragmented. There were different labs in different locations competing with each other. So there was a Cary lab here, there was a Toronto lab, there was a lab in California. We're all competing with each other, building different but competing technologies. And we had a flagship development tool product called Visual Age, and the technology in that was very brittle. So in response to this key business challenge of bringing developers to the WebSphere platform, we decided we needed to build a tools platform, create an ecosystem around it, an external ecosystem around it, and secondarily, we needed to solve the internal problem of all this duplicate, wasteful, fragmented effort within IBM. So we came up with a plan after some discussion where we would build a tools platform which would basically be infrastructure for building application development tools of various kinds. We would build on top of that, and I guess I have some arrows that should go here that are missing. We would build on top of that a Java IDE and sort of a language processing infrastructure, like for parsing and doing debuggers and all that sort of stuff, on top of this platform. And this dotted line is to show that we consider this the core of what we had to do in order to create the technology to build good application development tools to achieve our business objectives. And then we also said, you know, we need to have some teams in IBM build products, not just platform, but product. So IBM WebSphere Studio was the brand, and so we built those on top of this platform, almost in parallel, not quite. And then we wanted to have third parties build on the same platform. So that's the approach that we decided to take. So now if you look at the key decisions, so this was a slide I gave at the conference. First of all, I assume everybody is familiar with Conways Law, or if you're not familiar with the name, you're familiar with the idea, which basically says that the architecture of your system is going to reflect the structure of your organization. And I believe in that extremely strongly. So what I did is I set up two teams to work on those components below the line on the previous diagram. Those two teams were part of an IBM subsidiary. It was a company that IBM had purchased in 95 or 6, I don't remember exactly when. And that was very important. So those two teams were in the same physical location. They had the same leadership, but we kept them separate so that there was a clear boundary, an architectural boundary, between what was the platform and what was the Java IDE. We wanted that boundary to be there. So it was important to structure it that way. And then we set up a third team to build that WebSphere Studio product, and that was actually a team primarily in Raleigh. And again, we wanted there to be a clear separation between the platform part and the product part. There's one more crucial thing that I didn't write on the slide, and that is that the teams that worked for the subsidiary could bypass IBM processes, because the subsidiary was run by a CEO who reported to a board of directors that we controlled.
Was that Rational?
No, that was before Rational. It was a company called OTI, Object Technology Incorporated. It was run by Dave Thomas in Ottawa. So that was, in retrospect, I mean, it was intentional, but in retrospect, it turns out to be a crucial thing that we did, is to bypass those processes.
Does that still count as a big company?
Well, yes, I think so, because one of the things, if you asked me for advice on how to do something like this, I would tell you to figure out a way to achieve those effects. It doesn't have to be a subsidiary. Subsidiary is nice, but there are other ways you can do it. And if we have time at the end, I'm happy to talk about it. And I've done some other things along those lines in the past. So by early 2001, we had good technology, and nobody was paying much attention. Specifically, nobody outside of IBM was paying much attention. But we wanted to bring developers to WebSphere. We wanted to compete with Microsoft, so this wasn't very good. And so we decided that the technology wasn't enough. We had to do something to change the game. And so IBM had some experience working with Apache on the Apache HTTP server and helping Apache. So we decided that open source was the way to go. And we put together what at the time was a very novel approach. We formed an open source project. We gave the code to this open source project. And at the same time, we formed a consortium of companies. In the beginning, it was 9 companies, including IBM. And we formed an organization and said that that consortium is concerned with doing things like owning the trademark for Eclipse, doing some marketing around Eclipse, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was we would have a true open source project, but we could keep some level of guidance, give some level of guidance on the commercial aspects. This was widely praised by the press and analyst community. So people made words like, suddenly IBM is cool. It was pretty neat when this sort of thing happened. One of these guys talked about it being an audacious open source gambit, and it's real code designed to do real work. So we thought this was really a lot of fun when this happened. And just to give you kind of a pictorial view of this, this is what it looked like. We had this thing called the Eclipse Consortium, and the reality of it was that there was IBM in the middle, and there were a whole bunch of other companies kind of around it. And we weren't getting the traction that we had hoped for. It was better than before we open sourced it. And Gartner, which is a major analyst, advised us that a lot of the people we were trying to work with said that the IBM control was still an obstacle. So in January of 2004, we made this transition. And IBM spun off this consortium, gave up all the legal control and ownership of it. We formed a nonprofit with its own executive director, with a budget that came from dues from members, and they had their own staff, and IBM became one of the spokes, a big spoke to be sure, in that new structure. And that did it. Once we did that, this thing took off. So Eclipse 3.0 was released at the same time this conference I was speaking at was held, and we just saw dramatic growth in the whole ecosystem once we did that. And at the time, there were a whole bunch of announcements of companies announcing products at the conference. I don't know the numbers now, but there are 200 to 300 companies that are members of the Eclipse Foundation at this point. I know that at the time I left IBM, there were probably 100 IBM products that were based on Eclipse, and there are many, many other companies that have products based on Eclipse, or they release plugins for their products on Eclipse. So it turned into a huge success and a big disruption in the marketplace. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that Microsoft Visual Studio and Eclipse are the 2 platforms for application development tools, full stop. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what I think the critical success factors were for making this happen. And the first one might be surprising to you. The first one is alignment with the business goals of the organization. And the reason that this is important is when you set up very ambitious goals and you make big promises in an organization like IBM, there are lots of people that come after you and say, it's not going to happen, this is a bad idea, whatever. I can remember very vividly still, many years later, being in a quarterly executive meeting with the general manager of WebSphere, and the CFO for that division stood up at this meeting and started talking about how there's no profit coming from Lee's effort here. We should cut the budget back. and I'm getting ready to fight. And before I could say anything, the general manager of the division said, looking at the CFO, "You don't know what you're talking about. We're doing this because we have to bring developers to WebSphere." That was it. So having support because your effort is aligned with the business goals is extremely, extremely valuable. I will also say that the executives, that executive and one under him, who I reported to, were very enlightened. They understood the opportunity, and they had the courage to let us spend the money and to do this kind of radical stuff at the time. Another big thing I mentioned that I believe is exceedingly important is our ability to form the right organization structure and to align the organization structure with our architectural goals. If we hadn't done that, my guess is we would have ended up with a big kind of mushed together thing that did the initial goals but wouldn't be sustainable over time. So I think that was important. We were able to get the right degree of coupling and the right degree of isolation. Isolation is another thing that I want to mention. One of the failure modes that Christensen talks about in his books is kind of the one day at a time setting of priorities. And so it goes like this. So you're a customer and you call up an executive and you say, "I'm having trouble with your product." And the executive says, "We'll fix that right away." And then he goes to the next, to the best person who can fix it. And he says, "I want you to fix that right away." That guy might be the key guy on this new effort. And he now is diverted to go off and solve that customer problem. And you do that a day at a time and everything slips. So the ability to isolate, so we actually had it set up where people were instructed, do not answer your phone unless it comes from one of your managers because you are supposed to be focused. Very, very important and not so obvious to people. I already mentioned the subsidiary structure was great because it allowed us to bypass IBM processes. There are other ways of doing it, but that helped us a lot. Sometimes people say, well, if you want to do innovation, do it in a startup. There are some situations where being in a big company really helps. First of all, we had a big budget to do this on. But more importantly, there are lots of people out in the industry that when IBM speaks rather than Lee from Lee's software, it means something. And I'm pretty convinced that we could not have done this without IBM's muscle behind it in terms of just people taking IBM seriously. So that's very, very important. And I think the last one here is strong technology is a given, but what really made this work for us is the business model. And you can tell from the sequence, when we first made it into an open source project, it didn't take off. It was getting the business model right that made it take off. And I think that's generally a very important lesson for people who are trying to do innovation in big companies. Okay, so what I want to do now, oops. Okay, well, I did my build all at once. What I want to do now is go back to the Microsoft Office example. So I already talked about, there's a long sequence over time of releases of the desktop client for Microsoft Office, starting back in the early days of Windows 3.1, and that one out there is the 2013 version of Office. They also had, they have servers. So the Exchange server is Microsoft's email server, which came out in around 2006 and continues to go through major innovations. And in some way of thinking, these products have gotten more capability over time, sustaining innovation. Okay? But there's some interesting problems when you're doing sustaining innovation. Since my wife is here, I'll tell a story that we have. So every year, my wife likes to send out, Christmas holiday letters. And we have this spreadsheet that's got all the names and addresses in it. And every year, she says, "Lee, how do I do the addresses?" And so every year, I have to learn how to do the latest incarnation of mail merge. How complicated can they make mail merge? Version after version, right? There's some data, let me look here. There was a study done in 2011 of IT organizations that found that 74% of IT organizations in 2011 still supported Office 2003. Okay, so the increase in capability was not that relevant to a lot of the customers. It wasn't good enough to get them to move forward with it. And the point here is that these kind of sustaining innovations often take you to having capability that's greater than what most people want. And then the companies have a hard time figuring out how to motivate people to upgrade. One of the interesting stories that I have from my time at Microsoft is I was talking to a pretty senior guy in the Office organization. And he was griping because, in the time I was there, which is out towards this time frame, Google was coming out with Google Apps and was starting to compete. And the guy was complaining and saying, it's not fair. Google is competing with the 2003 version of Office, and it's because the sustaining innovation wasn't compelling enough to get people to upgrade. So people were using this old stuff. Okay, so this is really important to remember, that often sustaining innovation gets into a place that gives greater capability than most people want. One of the driving factors for big companies is often their biggest, best customers are the ones who want more and more capability, and they'll respond to them, which drives them further up here. And it's less and less relevant to most people. So what happens is you have to, okay, so enter Google Apps. So Google Apps comes in, and I'm not trying to, all right, my build skills are not so great. Google Apps comes in, and the capabilities of Google Apps in the beginning were really not great. I remember, in fact, Rich will know from when we were in Morphormix, I had this great idea. We weren't going to buy Office in Morphormix. We were going to use Google Apps. And we quickly learned that this was not going to work. The capability was less than what we wanted. But over time, Google's been increasing the capability. And I can't tell you exactly. See, if I had this build stuff working properly. There you go. I can't tell you exactly what's happening here, right? Whether Google Apps is now exceeding, in some areas, like Google Apps collaboration capabilities is a lot better than what Office has. But in terms of fancy formatting, Office is still better than Google Apps. So these lines cross someplace. And at some point, Google's good enough and people are going to switch to it because it has a better business model. I pay a low monthly subscription fee, or it's free, or whatever. So if my builds had worked properly, then the next thing that happened was Microsoft said, wow, Google is disrupting us. And rather than just get disrupted, they said, we ought to disrupt ourselves. And so they created something called Office 365. And Office 365 used the existing capabilities in the client, and it used some of the existing capabilities in Exchange Server and SharePoint Server, and it was basically a hosting kind of thing. And they came out in 2008, I think it was, with a cleverly named service called BPOS, Business Productivity Online Services. Very cleverly named. And when they released this again in June of 2011, that's when they switched it to Office 365. And then in 2013, they've introduced other clients, the iOS client, the Android client, web client, etc. So they are driving up this line here, and now you have Google and Microsoft really competing in this space with new business model. Google and Microsoft have different business models, but they're competing there. And they've decided to disrupt their own business, which I think is a great thing. Otherwise, you're Kodak at some point. So how was Office 365 done? What lessons can we learn from that? So first of all, Office 365, or actually BPOS, was initiated by a very strong executive who had a lot of credibility in Microsoft. He had done some very successful products in the past. So when he spoke, people listened. This one's interesting. It was done by a separate team. You would think this was done by the Office organization. No, this executive said, we're going to form a separate team, and it's going to be in the server and tools business of Microsoft, and we'll get some people from Office, and we'll get some help from Office, but we're not going to report to Office. So there's an example. I think you had asked me, I don't know your name, in the red shirt, if you don't have a subsidiary, well, here's another response, is forming an organization outside. Another classic example of this is when HP first started doing inkjet printers. They did it in the same organization that did laser printers, and you can guess how well that worked. Inkjet printers didn't take off until they moved the inkjet printer effort to Colorado in a different organization. And so this is very important to be able to protect a team. So this guy formed this team. He also had support from Steve Ballmer, which was very important. He called that in occasionally to get the protection he needed. The other really interesting thing, which wasn't widely publicized, but many people knew, there was a plan that said once this was released as a product, it was going to mainstream back into the Office organization. That was a way to get the Office organization to maybe be more receptive, that he wasn't trying to cut Office out of things. He was just trying to get it started, and then it would come back into Office. And indeed, that's what has happened. But that was known by the senior people, and I think it was a very clever move. At this point, Office 365 is seen within Microsoft to be crucial to the success of their Office business. So they did a disruption on their own business, and I think now they're entering a sustaining mode, and it's going to be very interesting to see where they go. Okay, so those are two examples that I've seen up close, and I want to get back now to Christensen's model. The model is very widely accepted. I'm not sure how familiar people are with it in the computer science community, but in the business community, it's widely accepted. When I took some executive education in the early 2000s as part of IBM, it was taught. And I find that the model fits very well with the experience that I've had. Interestingly, the model is extremely well accepted, but there was a paper published by someone named Jill Lepore in 2014, and she said the model's a crock. She didn't quite say it that way, but pretty close. And she argued that it's not really predictive and it's based on anecdote. I don't accept her argument, but if you're interested in innovation and how you might think about innovation, it's useful to both read Christensen's work and to read Lepore's kind of rebuttal that happened this year. So let me just talk about the model. So there's a paper, if you want to get a sort of high-level, quick dose of Christensen, at the end I have a little bibliography. There's a paper that he wrote in Harvard Business Review. It's about, 15 pages, and it's very good. I took this from the second of those two books, and it probably looks pretty familiar to you, given what I showed you before, which is not an accident. So you have sustaining innovations that are going along and progressing, and then you have a line that says, here's what customers actually can utilize or absorb. And sustaining innovations are often driven to rise faster than that demand, and they're driven often by the best customers, which is why successful companies are really good at sustaining innovation, because they develop good mechanisms for listening to their customers, doing what their customers want. Okay? But that often takes them to the wrong place. Okay? And then there's a range of performance that customers can utilize. Many disruptive innovations come in by coming in at a lower level of performance, but with some other attribute that's really good. So Christensen's early first book, the examples are drawn from the disk drive industry. So, at one point people had really big physical disk drives, and they were trying to make them faster and higher capacity. And then somebody would come along and say, we could make a disk drive that has lower speed, is a little bit slower, but it's this big instead of this big, and it draws a lot less power. A good example is people came along with a disk drive that was this big, and somebody made something called the iPod because they had those kind of disk drives. That was a disruptive innovation. And Christensen talks about how those kind of disruptions put disk drive company after disk drive company out of business. Okay? So in later versions of Christensen's theory, he makes it a little bit more complicated, and he talks about there are two kinds of disruption. There's so-called low-end disruption, which is basically what I just talked about, where you have products that are getting better and better, and you come in at a lower end, lower performance, but better in some other dimension. Like it might be lower cost, or it might be smaller, or whatever. And you start making progress addressing the needs of customers who are overserved by the sustaining line. So that's what he calls a low-end disruption. And then there is a new market disruption, where basically what you're doing is you're competing against people who are not buying something in that space. Okay, when disk drives were, refrigerator size, I didn't have one in my house. But now the disk drives are like this. I'm a consumer of disk drives. That's an example of a new market disruption. So this whole notion of how disruptive innovation happens is an important part of Christensen's model. The other important part is what he calls the RPV Framework. Resources, processes, and values. And this has a lot to do with what organizations are capable of doing. So if you have people who are really great at listening to customers and designing incremental features for your products, and those are the kind of people you have, that's what you're going to get. Or if you have processes that do something like they look at your existing market and your existing customer set and ask how much improved revenue you can get or improved margin you can get by tweaking the current product, that's what you're going to get. And if you have a culture that says, if Lee tries something and it turns out to be a failure, his career is over, then Lee's not going to try it. And even if you say, our company innovates, but if what people see happen is that people get punished for trying and failing, it's not going to happen. It's one of the great things about startups is entrepreneurs try things, and as long as they don't do stupid stuff, if they fail, they try again. They're given a chance again. And that's a cultural thing. That's a cultural thing. Resources, obvious, do you have people with the right skills, technical and otherwise? Do you have money? In some industries, do you have equipment? Do you have a brand? I talked about IBM Cloud. That IBM brand is a resource that you can use when you're trying to create a business. I mentioned the processes. Both IBM and HP have very formal product development processes. I can remember meetings going through design checkpoint meetings at IBM where people brought in 130 PowerPoint slides to what was supposed to be an hour-and-a-half meeting. And you can just imagine how that goes. It's not a very effective way for getting things done, and that's one of the reasons why I emphasize how important it was to be able to bypass processes in the two examples that I gave you. Values, I talked about things about are people punished for trying things. Other things are really important. Financial hurdles. In some companies, they have a goal that says we're going to grow the company, we're going to grow the company 5%. That's our goal. Grow the revenue 5%. Well, if you're a company that's got $100 billion worth of revenue, that's a big challenge, right? And so a company that has value that any new business has to contribute significantly to that growth target, they're not going to do new things because very little new stuff could you make a credible argument is going to contribute to that sort of revenue growth. How tightly are people's time managed? If you have a company and the way you manage people is you track everything they do and you make sure they're busy all the time, they're not going to have the energy to put into trying new things. That's a value in the company. And you see things like Google's so-called 20% time as an example. And then another value is how flexible are they in letting you create the right organizational structures? That's really important. I talked about how important that was in those two examples. So these are all part of the RPV framework, and Christensen goes into a lot of detail about these. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in this whole topic, to read some of his work. So to summarize, I think big companies can do disruptive innovation. And in fact, you have some advantages doing disruptive innovation in big companies. But the whole, getting the correct RPV is really hard to get in big companies. So I'm not trying to say if you want to innovate, run and work for IBM. I'm just saying that it's possible under the right set of circumstances and thinking about things in the right way to do really innovative things at a big company that you probably couldn't do at a small company. I talked about the right organization structure is essential, and this is also very important. I talked about how the plan in Office 365 was to mainstream back into the Office organization. You've got to think about how the right structure changes over time because your goals change. And so when Office 365 was out the door, the goal had to be to use the huge marketing capability that the Office organization had. That was very, very important, and you weren't going to be able to do that if you weren't part of that team. So you have to be flexible, and you have to think about what's right over time. And I mentioned this is crucial. In big companies, there are antibodies. They will come after you with a vengeance, and you need protection. So if you can't get some executive support that can effectively protect you, you're probably not going to make it. So those are, I think, some important aspects. So I have here some reading. The top two are the two books. They're kind of long. They're a little bit outdated. If you want to get a high-level overview, I would recommend this paper. It's only, I see now, 10 pages. It gives you a good view. Jill Lepore's paper, Debunking Christensen's Model. Like I say, I don't agree with it, but it's still interesting. And then if you're interested in the whole way that Eclipse was done and how it worked within IBM, a business school professor, she's no longer there, at Harvard, wrote two cases for the Harvard Business School case study stuff about what we did in Eclipse. And so you can read that if you're interested in sort of a more objective view from somebody on the side. With that, I'm finished and happy to take any comments or questions.
So, if I understand you right, your argument is that Microsoft has added features that users don't want now and they never want, right?
Most users.
And is that because users don't know about these features or don't know what's good for them? Or
Well, I mean, there's two tensions, right? So if I talk to my wife and say, let's spend $150 to buy the next version of Word, and she says, well, why would I do that? And I say, well, they added a new capability to mail merge, and she's going to say, I can't figure out how to use what's in there now. So there's a cost to moving to their new version. Unless you see a real benefit, why would you take on the cost? And the same thing's true in a company. So if you're a customer of Microsoft's, and let's say you have 500 employees, all of whom have Office, and Microsoft comes along and says, Office 2015. And you say, well, why? They got to figure out a reason to give that's going to cause somebody to want to spend the money, and more important than the money, the time of updating the version of Office on every single laptop in the organization, and of training their help desk to deal with questions about this transition and with the new system. So you got to have a balance, and it's really hard for companies to come up with what are the new features that'll overcome that inertia.
lots of people make this argument, including in Microsoft, and I always tell them, tell me one feature that is not good for you, and they cannot come up with that.
Yeah, that's it's not that the features are bad for you. It's that why would I bother? It's going to take me time, effort, and money to upgrade. And unless I'm getting something that is important to me, not important to you, but important to me, why would I spend the money and the time and the disruption to do that? That's really the problem. Yes, Mark.
Most people aren't doing new things. I think that they figured out from the last release how to do whatever they need to do.
Yeah.
And so, unless you have some brand new thing that matches what they want to do new, there's no reason for them to move at all. They already
Right.
know how to do what they need.
That's right. And that's why sustaining innovation is so hard and why it's relatively easy to disrupt it. Like when Google came along and said, you know, you don't need to install this big Office thing on your machine. You don't need to pay us, you know, hundreds of dollars. It's free. Just go to your web browser, use Google Docs, it's there. And that's pretty compelling. So, you know, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Sure. In a large company, where does innovation typically come from? Does it come from the top down, bottom up?
Yes. It sounded like a flip answer, but it's really intended to be accurate. There are times when the senior executives see what's happening in terms of somebody else disrupting, or they see an opportunity and they want some innovation to happen in a space, and they'll say it, and they'll assign a team. But unless they know how things really work, they might not get an innovation. Sometimes they understand enough and they can do the right things and they can create an innovation. Sometimes it happens bottom up with receptive executives. So the Eclipse stuff was started because myself and two other guys wrote a paper. At the time, IBM was big on the phrase e-business. And we wrote a paper called the E-Business Application Framework. We're not marketing people. And we kind of shopped that around in IBM, and we convinced a bunch of people that we should build this new tools platform, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of, I would say, middle up. You know, I wasn't junior at the time. I knew the executives, they trusted me, et cetera. But I wasn't at the top of the company either. And so we proposed something, and then we got support from the senior people who could really give us the protection that we needed. And sometimes you get stuff that comes all the way from the bottom, and the challenge there is both for the opportunity to be recognized and for somebody who can take the right action to separate that out and let it thrive to happen. So it really requires, you know, all levels. And I haven't talked about it. There's a whole other set of dimensions here. Like if you're in a company and you have a sales force, there are a whole set of issues of how you get your salespeople to pay attention to selling this new thing. Because usually salespeople are compensated with commission, and they get commission on selling the stuff that moves already. They know how to go in and have a conversation with you and get you to buy more licenses. That's what they're going to do. They're not going to pay attention to the new thing. So there's a whole other set of stuff that you have to do. So it really requires at a lot of different levels in a company. Yes?
Working for a competitor, wouldn't you call being a failure?
Okay, fair point. It's not a failure. However, if you're a financial kind of person and you look at the amount of money that has been spent on Bing and you look at the amount of revenue that can be attributed to it, it's a failure.
Just like Eclipse?
Like Eclipse could be viewed that way, absolutely. But I would say that Bing has not had nearly the impact on the ecosystem. They've had an impact on Google. They've made Google step up their game some because they've introduced competition. And they're starting to have a bigger impact on Microsoft, and it might turn out to be significant because they're using Bing throughout their product line or some of the Bing technology. So it might be that my statement is premature, and that'll change over time. Absolutely. But I can tell you, having been in Microsoft, lots and lots of people groused about how much money those Bing guys were spending for what little they were delivering. But that's changed. And Satya Nadella ran engineering for Bing. And now as the CEO of Microsoft, he probably has a different viewpoint. So, yes?
So in economics, you're taught that businesses are profit maximizers, at least in principle. And in reality, particularly in the way the market works now, they're really risk minimizers, right? And innovation is inherently about risk. So if you look at what Dr. Brooks did at IBM with 360, they bet the company on this new architecture. Can you see a company like IBM doing something like that in today's world? Is that even possible anymore?
Well, let me not answer that specifically about IBM, but make it a broader question. Yeah, I do see companies taking big risks. Although maybe it's a little bit, but I look at a company like Tesla, for example. Right? That's a big risk. Now, it's not an established, successful company taking the risk. That might be the difference.
That's what I mean. Like that was in 360 was an innovation, no doubt about it, right? But you couldn't. I don't think you could make a kind of a long-term investment in the way that things work these days.
Yeah. Okay. So I would agree with you. The way that the public market works now makes it very hard for an executive to take a bet that's visible. So a bet that the size that Watson took with the 360 was a very visible bet your company kind of thing. The bet that was taken on Eclipse, nobody in the financial community would have even noticed it as a blip, right? I thought it was a lot of money. It was maybe $40 million worth of investment. Okay, it wasn't all the company's money. But I do agree with you that I think that the environment on Wall Street today and the focus on shareholder value and short-term profits makes betting the company a much more difficult thing to do. Yeah. Yeah, Henry.
I wonder if we could be slightly more generous to company leaders then and now. That is, betting the company is irresponsible. If IBM 360 would have failed rather than succeeded, then not only would Watson and others been used as an example of irresponsible leadership, but it would have been justified as such.
Yeah, the winners write the history.
Yeah.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of truth in that.
No, not necessarily. But look, Kodak used an example. Okay, maybe it's justified, but they would have bet the company 20 years before on something and would have failed.
See, I don't, I was not part of Kodak. I don't know the details, but my subjective opinion from what I've read is it's not that they didn't recognize that there was this huge threat. It's not that they didn't know that they had to get into digital. It's that they weren't willing to make the decisions about shifting resources to focus on digital, even if it came at the expense of their existing business. I'll tell you a story. This is on a completely different scale, but it's something I can make personal. So at one point in my career, I was working on what I thought was an extremely innovative incremental C++ programming environment. This was in the mid-90s. And it was great. It was really great. Some guy in IBM comes to me and he says, Lee, Java's coming along. Java's going to be big. We should do the same thing we're doing for C++. We should do that for Java. And I said, yeah, you're right. When we finish the C++ one, we'll start working on the Java one. And he said, no, that's not what I mean. Stop the C++ one and shift to the Java one because that's what's going to be big. And I didn't listen to him. I made a big mistake. I probably set us back a couple of years by saying, let's finish what we were doing. And I think it's that kind of decision taken by relatively low-level people like I was at the time that can cause you to kind of step by step get into this sort of Kodak moment. Yeah. Rich?
Along the same lines, if you look at what healthy companies do, or maybe it's the ones that succeed in bucking that tide, what do they do? What are good habits? What are the disruptive things that these companies do to buck that tide?
First of all, there aren't many companies that buck that tide. Second of all, I think that companies that succeed in responding to disruption don't do it necessarily by just duplicating what the disruptor is doing. I was in IBM in the mid-90s or early 90s when IBM was going through really terrible times. I mean, they were losing maybe $5 billion a year. And even a big company like IBM can't succeed like that. That's when they were being disrupted by, the mini computer, the DEC kind of stuff. And one of the things that was very clever about what Gerstner did was he caught onto this thing called the internet. And he said, we're going to bet on the internet. Rather than saying, we're going to compete head-to-head with DEC, who's already multiple years ahead of us, we're going to get on the internet wave. And that was an enormously important and successful decision. And I believe that's what IBM did to survive the disruption that was going on. But a lot of companies don't make it. They get bought. You know, they merge, but you know what that usually means. Yeah.
So Apple is perceived to be a consistently disruptive company. What is it that they do different than some of the other ones that are less, or maybe that's misperception?
So I don't know a lot. I don't know anything about how Apple works inside. Okay. You know, I think one of the really interesting questions is going to be whether Apple's culture, their RPV, if you will, is going to allow them to be disruptive in the way that they've been, or whether that was a Steve Jobs thing. I have no clue. But it's a really interesting question. Yeah?
Can it happen that a company has just too many resources in something that is destined to die, that they can't, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is you know, if you work for a big company with successful products, you start to talk about some of the products being legacy products. These are the products where you're bringing in the vast majority of your revenue. Your most important customers are using these products. There's either very low positive growth or somewhat negative growth in those products. And you have a great team of people who can keep pushing those products along. And then you want to disrupt, and you say, manager comes to you and says, I need some more money to do this new thing. And you say, what do you mean you need some more money? You have a $20 million budget. Why don't you take $5 million of that $20 million budget you're spending on that old thing and use it to start the new thing? And a lot of executives will not make that decision. And I think that that's one of the big failure modes. It's really, really hard to say, I have these products. Another similar example is companies that grow by acquisition. They have all these products. They're all different. It's all fragmented. They overlap. And they really should rebuild something that, you know, makes sense. So when you would look at a product brochure, you could say, yeah, I understand why this is. But most companies struggle to make the kind of decision to take the hit on short-term revenue and to make that transition. It's a really hard thing to do.
Your biggest competitor is your own success.
That's right. And that's Christensen's key point, is that big companies are great at sustaining innovation, and they really struggle to do the disruptive. Mark?
There are two aspects to the change that are required. One is the internal development activity. You can get all kinds of fun debates within a group like between the DC and the mainframe, for example, as to who should do what. But I think the more important problem turns out to be when the salesman walks up to the customer who says, I would like something, and the salesman has the opportunity to offer two different things.
You bet.
And the customers have no way of rationalizing that, no matter what the internal company debate.
So let me make that very concrete. The first job I had when I moved into IBM Software Group, I was called the Director of Architecture for the WebSphere organization. So WebSphere is a Java application server, which you can think of as something that you can use as a back-end server for processing transactions. IBM had a mainframe product called Kix. Probably every one of you has run transactions through Kix because most large banks still use Kix as their core transaction processing engine. It runs on the mainframe, extremely reliable, et cetera, et cetera. One of my first jobs as the Director of Architecture was to go visit customers where the following thing had happened. On Monday, the WebSphere sales team went and said, you guys ought to be using WebSphere because it's Java and it's new and it's cool and it's whatever they said. And on Tuesday, the Kix sales team went back to that customer and said, what are you smoking to think about using this newfangled thing? You should stay on Kix. And so IBM was competing in front of the customer, and my job was to figure out how do we fix that. It was very interesting. And there's no good solution, but absolutely the competition within organizations is a huge problem. I'm happy to keep taking questions, but I don't know if there are other time constraints, Steve, or I'm happy to keep going if we want. Pardon?
Why don't we end it here and there's a reception outside?
Sounds great.
Thank you again.
Thank you.